Miss Marple exposed the killer, but his motive will haunt you. Chapter 1. The stranger beneath the elm trees. The village of St. Mary Mead lay bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, its cobblestone streets quiet, save for the occasional trill of a blackbird or the distant creak of a garden gate. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting needles clicking softly as her sharp blue eyes scanned the lane below. The village was, as always, a picture of tranquillity. But Miss Marple had long since learned that tranquillity often masked deeper currents. It was the stranger who first stirred the waters. He arrived on foot, his silhouette cutting a sharp figure against the horizon as he walked down the lane. Tall and lean, with a hat pulled low over his face, he moved with a deliberate grace that seemed out of place in the sleepy village. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch as she watched him stop beneath the elm trees, his gaze sweeping over the cottages with an intensity that made her uneasy. "Now, who might you be?" she murmured to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. The stranger's presence did not go unnoticed by the rest of the village. Mrs. Bartlett, the postmistress, peered out from behind her lace curtains, her lips pursed in disapproval. Old Mr. Pye, who was trimming his hedges, straightened up and squinted at the man as though trying to place him. Even the vicar, who was known for his unshakable cheer, paused in his stroll to offer a polite nod, though the stranger merely tipped his hat in return and continued on his way. By evening, the village was abuzz with speculation. Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, listened intently as the rumours swirled during her weekly tea with Mrs. Bartlett and the vicar's wife, Mrs. Harmon. "He's staying at the inn," Mrs. Bartlett announced, her tone suggesting she had uncovered a state secret. "Booked a room for a week, though he didn't say why he's here." "Perhaps he's a writer," Mrs. Harmon suggested, pouring tea with a practised hand. "St. Mary Mead is quite picturesque after all." "Or a detective," Miss Marple said mildly, her eyes twinkling. "Though one does wonder what he might be detecting in our little village." The conversation shifted, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the stranger. There was something about him, a quiet intensity, a watchfulness, that set him apart. She had seen that look before, though she couldn't quite place where. The next morning, the stranger's presence took on a more ominous tone. Miss Marple was tending to her roses when she overheard a conversation between young Tommy Pierce and his mother. "He was asking about Lady Beatrice," Tommy said, his voice tinged with excitement. "Wanted to know if she still lived at the manor." Miss Marple's hands stilled. Lady Beatrice, the reclusive widow who rarely left her estate, was a figure of fascination in the village. Her wealth and eccentricities made her the subject of endless gossip, but few dared to approach her directly. "What did you tell him?" Mrs. Pierce asked, her tone wary. "I said she did," Tommy replied. "But he didn't say why he wanted to know." Miss Marple frowned, her mind racing. The stranger's interest in Lady Beatrice was curious and potentially troubling. She resolved to keep a closer eye on him, though she knew better than to jump to conclusions. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village settled into its usual quiet, Miss Marple sat by her window once more. The stranger was nowhere to be seen, but the air felt heavier somehow, as though the village itself was holding its breath. She picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly in the stillness. "Something is stirring," she murmured to herself, "and I dare say it won't be long before we find out what." Chapter 2. A Feast of Shadows. The invitation arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on a crisp morning, delivered by a stiff-backed footman in Lady Beatrice's livery. The envelope was thick and cream-coloured, the handwriting elegant but precise. Miss Marple opened it with a faint smile, though her eyes narrowed slightly as she read the contents. "A dinner party," she murmured, setting the invitation aside. "Ah, how very unexpected!" Lady Beatrice was not known for her hospitality. In fact, she had not hosted a gathering at the manor in years. The sudden invitation, coming so soon after the stranger's arrival, struck Miss Marple as more than a coincidence. She resolved to attend, though not without a healthy dose of curiosity and caution. That evening, Miss Marple donned her best lavender dress and made her way to the manor. The house loomed at the end of a long tree-lined drive, its windows glowing faintly in the gathering dusk. As she approached, she noticed the stranger from the village standing near the entrance, his hat in hand and his expression unreadable. "Good evening," Miss Marple said pleasantly, pausing beside him. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." The man turned, his sharp eyes meeting hers. "Good evening," he replied, his voice low and measured. "I'm Mr. Grayson. A pleasure to meet you, Miss—" "Marple," she supplied, her smile never wavering. "Jane Marple. I don't often see new faces in St. Mary Mead. Are you here on business, Mr. Grayson?" "In a manner of speaking," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I've been meaning to visit Lady Beatrice for some time." Before Miss Marple could press further, the door opened and they were ushered inside. The manor's interior was as grand as its exterior, with high ceilings, polished wood panelling, and a sweeping staircase that led to the upper floors. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and roses, though there was an undercurrent of something else, something faintly metallic, like the tang of old coins. The other guests had already gathered in the drawing-room. Miss Marple recognised most of them: the vicar and his wife, Mrs. Harmon, Dr. Cartwright, the village physician, and Mrs. Henshaw, a widow who lived on the outskirts of the village. There were a few unfamiliar faces as well, including a young woman with striking auburn hair, and a man in a tailored suit who seemed out of place among the more modestly dressed villagers. Lady Beatrice herself was a striking figure, tall and regal, with silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. She greeted Miss Marple with a polite nod, though her eyes lingered on Mr. Grayson for a moment too long. "Welcome, everyone," Lady Beatrice said, her voice carrying the faintest hint of an accent. "I'm so pleased you could join me this evening. It's been far too long since I've had the pleasure of company." The dinner was a lavish affair, with multiple courses and fine wines. The conversation flowed easily at first, though Miss Marple noted the undercurrents of tension. Mr. Grayson remained quiet, his sharp eyes scanning the room as though cataloguing every detail. The auburn-haired woman, introduced as Miss Evelyn Hart, seemed nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her glass. It was during the dessert course that the first crack appeared in the evening's veneer. Lady Beatrice raised her glass, her smile brittle. "To old friends and new," she said, her gaze flickering toward Mr. Grayson. "May this evening be the start of many more." As the guests raised their glasses, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. The sound was followed by a muffled cry, and then silence. The room froze, the air thick with unease. "What on earth?" Lady Beatrice began, but she was interrupted by the arrival of a pale-faced maid. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," the maid stammered, her eyes wide with fear. "It's just the teacup. It's broken." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Which teacup?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "The one from the set," the maid replied, wringing her hands. "The one with the gold trim. It just shattered." Beatrice's face drained of colour. "That's impossible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That set hasn't been used in years." The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Miss Marple glanced at Mr. Grayson, who was watching Lady Beatrice with an intensity that bordered on predatory. "Perhaps it was an accident," Mrs. Harmon suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, her mind already racing. But she knew better than to dismiss such a thing as mere coincidence. As the guests began to murmur among themselves, Miss Marple excused herself and made her way to the kitchen. The broken teacup lay in pieces on the floor, its gold trim glinting in the light. She knelt beside it, her fingers brushing the shards. "Too neat," she murmured, her eyes narrowing. "Too intentional." Chapter 3. The Crack in the Porcelain. The kitchen was eerily quiet, save for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Miss Marple knelt by the shattered teacup, her fingers carefully sifting through the fragments. The gold trim, though delicate, was unmistakable, a hallmark of Lady Beatrice's prized set, rumoured to have been a gift from her late husband. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, her sharp eyes noting the way the pieces had scattered. Pure, break was clean, almost deliberate, as though the cup had been dropped with purpose rather than clumsiness. She glanced up at the maid, who stood wringing her apron, her face pale. "Did you see what happened?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but probing. The maid shook her head. "No, ma'am. I was fetching the sugar when I heard it break. When I turned around, it was already on the floor." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. She rose to her feet, brushing her hands lightly on her skirt. "Thank you, dear. You've been very helpful." As she returned to the dining room, the guests were still murmuring among themselves, their unease palpable. Lady Beatrice sat stiffly at the head of the table, her hands clenched around her napkin. Mr. Grayson stood by the window, his expression inscrutable, while Miss Evelyn Hart fidgeted with her necklace, her eyes darting around the room. "Is everything all right, Miss Marple?" the vicar asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "Just a minor mishap," Miss Marple replied, her tone reassuring. "A teacup broke, but no harm done." Lady Beatrice's gaze snapped to her, a flicker of something, fear, anger, crossing her face before she composed herself. "Which cup was it?" she asked, her voice tight. "The one with the gold trim," Miss Marple said, watching her closely. Lady Beatrice's lips pressed into a thin line. "That set is irreplaceable," she said, her tone icy. "I'll have to speak to the staff about their carelessness." Miss Marple said nothing, though she noted the way Mr. Grayson's eyes lingered on Lady Beatrice, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room was thick, and she could feel the undercurrents of suspicion and unease swirling beneath the surface. The rest of the evening passed in a strained fashion. the earlier conviviality replaced by forced smiles and stilted conversation. Miss Marple observed it all, her mind quietly cataloguing every detail. The way Dr. Cartwright avoided eye contact with Lady Beatrice, the way Mrs. Henshaw's hands trembled as she reached for her wine-glass, the way Miss Evelyn Hart seemed to shrink into herself whenever Mr. Grayson glanced her way. As the guests began to take their leave, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, pretending to admire a painting while keeping a discreet eye on Lady Beatrice. The hostess stood by the fireplace, her back rigid, her fingers gripping the mantelpiece as though seeking support. "A fascinating piece," Miss Marple said, gesturing to the painting. "Is it a family heirloom?" Lady Beatrice turned, her expression softening slightly. "Yes, it's been in my family for generations. My late husband was quite fond of it." "It's lovely," Miss Marple said, her tone warm, "though I couldn't help but notice how distressed you were earlier. Is everything all right?" For a moment, Lady Beatrice seemed to waver, her composure cracking ever so slightly. But then she straightened, her mask of calm firmly back in place. "Of course," she said, her voice steady. "It's just a teacup, after all." Miss Marple nodded, though she wasn't convinced. As she made her way to the door, she glanced back at the drawing-room, her eyes lingering on the shattered remnants of the teacup that had been carefully swept into a dustpan. "Too neat," she murmured to herself as she stepped into the cool night air. "Too intentional." The walk back to her cottage was quiet, the village bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. But Miss Marple's mind was anything but still. The broken teacup, the tension at dinner, the stranger's watchful presence, it all pointed to something deeper, something darker. As she unlocked her front door, she paused, her gaze drifting toward the manor, its windows now dark and silent. "Something is stirring," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I dare say it's only just begun." Chapter 4. Footsteps in the Fog. The next morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a thick blanket of fog that clung to the cobblestone streets and curled around the eaves of the cottages. Miss Marple, ever an early riser, stood by her kitchen window, sipping her tea and watching the mist swirl in the pale dawn light. The village was quiet, the usual sounds of birdsong and distant chatter muted by the fog. But not all was still. As Miss Marple set down her teacup, her sharp eyes caught a movement near the edge of the lane. A figure emerged from the mist, walking briskly with their collar turned up against the chill. Even through the haze, she recognized the tall, lean frame of Mr. Grayson. He paused for a moment, glancing over his shoulder, as though checking if he was being followed before disappearing down the path that led to the manor. "Now, what business does he have at this hour?" Miss Marple murmured to herself, her curiosity piqued. She donned her coat and scarf, slipping out of her cottage, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime observing without being observed. The fog was a blessing in disguise, muffling her footsteps and providing ample cover as she followed the path toward the manor. As she approached the estate, she noticed a second figure, a woman cloaked in a dark shawl, moving furtively along the edge of the garden. Miss Marple's breath caught as she recognized Miss Evelyn Hart, her auburn hair barely visible beneath the shawl. The young woman glanced around nervously before slipping through a side gate into the manor grounds. Miss Marple hesitated, her mind racing. The presence of both Mr. Grayson and Miss Evelyn at the manor so early in the morning was no coincidence. She carefully made her way to the gate, peering through the iron bars. The garden was eerily quiet, the fog lending an otherworldly quality to the neatly trimmed hedges and rose bushes. Then she heard it, a low, muffled conversation coming from the direction of the greenhouse. Miss Marple moved closer, her footsteps silent on the damp grass. The voices grew clearer as she approached, though she couldn't make out the words. She crouched behind a rose bush, her heart pounding in her ears. "You shouldn't have come here," a man's voice said, sharp and urgent. It was Mr. Grayson. "I had no choice," Miss Evelyn replied, her voice trembling. "She's getting suspicious. If she finds out—" "She won't," Mr. Grayson interrupted. "Not if we're careful. But you need to stay out of sight. If anyone sees us together—" Miss Marple's breath hitched. She leaned closer, straining to hear more, but a sudden rustling in the bushes made her freeze. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the fog-shrouded garden. For a moment she saw nothing, and then a shadow moved, slipping away into the mist. Someone else was watching. Miss Marple's mind raced. Who else could be lurking in the garden? And what were Mr. Grayson and Miss Evelyn hiding? She glanced back toward the greenhouse, but the voices had fallen silent. The figures were gone, leaving only the faintest imprint of footsteps in the dew-covered grass. She straightened, her thoughts a whirlwind of questions. The broken teacup, the tension at the dinner party, the secretive meeting in the garden. It was all connected, she was sure of it. But how? As she made her way back to the lane, the fog began to lift, revealing the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Miss Marple paused, her gaze drifting toward the manor. The house stood silent and imposing, its windows dark and unyielding. "There's more to this than meets the eye," she murmured, her voice barely audible, "and I intend to find out what it is." Chapter 5. The Ink That Disappeared. The morning sun had fully risen by the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, but her mind was far from at ease. The mysterious conversation between Mr. Grayson and Miss Evelyn Hart lingered in her thoughts, as did the shadowy figure she had glimpsed in the garden. She brewed herself a fresh pot of tea, the ritual calming her nerves as she sorted through the puzzle pieces in her mind. Later that day, she decided to pay a visit to the vicarage. Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife, was a kind and observant woman, and Miss Marple hoped she might shed some light on the recent goings-on. As she walked down the lane, she noticed a small crowd gathered outside the post office, their voices hushed but urgent. "What's happened?" Miss Marple asked, approaching Mrs. Bartlett, who stood at the centre of the group. Mrs. Bartlett's face was flushed with excitement. "It's Lady Beatrice," she said, lowering her voice as though sharing a state secret. "She's been robbed." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. "Robbed? Of what?" "A letter," Mrs. Bartlett replied, her eyes wide. "A very important one, apparently. She's been in a state all morning, demanding that the constable investigate." Miss Marple's mind raced. A missing letter. Could it be connected to the broken teacup, the secretive meeting in the garden, or the stranger's arrival? She thanked Mrs. Bartlett and continued on her way to the vicarage, her thoughts churning. Mrs. Harmon greeted her warmly, ushering her into the cosy sitting room. "What brings you here, Miss Marple?" she asked, pouring tea into delicate china cups. "I heard about the missing letter," Miss Marple said, settling into her chair. "Do you know anything about it?" Mrs. Harmon sighed, her expression troubled. "Lady Beatrice came to see the vicar this morning. She was quite upset, said the letter was of great personal importance. She believes someone in the village took it. Did she say what the letter contained?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. Mrs. Harmon shook her head. "No, but she seemed frightened, more than I've ever seen her. She kept saying, 'If it falls into the wrong hands.'" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind working furiously. A missing letter, a frightened Lady Beatrice, and a village full of secrets. It was a potent combination. She decided to pay a visit to the manor herself, though she knew she would have to tread carefully. That afternoon she made her way to the estate, her steps measured and her expression composed. Lady Beatrice received her in the drawing-room, her usual poise replaced by a visible tension. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice strained, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I heard about your unfortunate loss," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "I thought I might offer my assistance, if you'll allow it." Lady Beatrice hesitated, her fingers tightening around the arm of her chair. "It's kind of you to offer," she said at last, "but I'm not sure there's anything to be done. The letter is gone, and I doubt it will be recovered." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said gently, "but sometimes a fresh perspective can be helpful. Do you have any idea who might have taken it?" Lady Beatrice's gaze flickered, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might confide in her. But then the moment passed, and Lady Beatrice shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "It could have been anyone." Miss Marple nodded, though she wasn't convinced. As she rose to leave, her eyes fell on a small writing desk in the corner of the room. The surface was cluttered with papers, but one item caught her attention. A blotter, its surface stained with ink. The pattern of the stains was unusual, as though someone had hastily wiped away fresh writing. "Thank you for your time, Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple said, her tone polite. "I do hope the letter turns up." As she walked back to the village, her mind was a whirlwind of questions. The missing letter, the ink-stained blotter, the tension in Lady Beatrice's manner. It all pointed to something far more significant than a simple theft. That evening, as she sat by her window with her knitting, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the shadowy figure in the garden. Who had been watching Mr. Grayson and Miss Evelyn? And what role did they play in this unfolding mystery? "The ink that disappeared," she murmured to herself, her needles clicking softly. But what was written, and why was it so important? Chapter 6. Secrets Among the Roses. The following day, Miss Marple decided to take a stroll through the village gardens, a place where whispers often lingered among the blooms. The roses were in full splendour, their petals heavy with dew, and the air was thick with their heady fragrance. It was a peaceful setting, but Miss Marple's mind was anything but calm. The missing letter, the ink-stained blotter, and the shadowy figure in the garden all swirled in her thoughts like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be fitted together. As she rounded a corner of the garden path, she spotted Miss Evelyn Hart sitting on a bench, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. The young woman was staring at a rose bush, her expression distant and troubled. Miss Marple approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. "Good morning, Miss Hart," she said. Her tone warm and inviting. Miss Evelyn looked up, her eyes widening slightly before she forced a smile. "Oh, good morning, Miss Marple. I didn't see you there. The roses are particularly lovely this year, aren't they?" Miss Marple said, sitting down beside her. "I find they always have a way of lifting one's spirits." Miss Evelyn nodded, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, they're beautiful." Miss Marple studied her for a moment, noting the faint shadows under her eyes and the way her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. "You seem troubled, my dear. Is everything all right?" Miss Evelyn hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. "It's nothing, really. Just village life can be a bit overwhelming at times." "I understand," Miss Marple said gently. "It's a small place, and everyone seems to know everyone else's business. But sometimes it helps to talk to someone who isn't so involved." Miss Evelyn glanced at her, her expression wavering. For a moment it seemed she might confide in Miss Marple, but then she shook her head. "Thank you, but I'm fine, really." Miss Marple nodded, though she wasn't convinced. She decided to change tactics. "I couldn't help but notice you at Lady Beatrice's dinner party the other night. You seemed rather preoccupied. Is she a friend of yours?" Miss Evelyn's face paled slightly. "Not exactly. I've only met her a few times. She's an acquaintance of my family." "I see," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "And Mr. Grayson? He seems to be quite the enigma. Do you know him well?" Miss Evelyn's hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles whitening. "No, not really. He's just someone I've met in passing." Miss Marple noted the tension in her voice and decided not to press further. Instead, she reached out and gently patted Miss Evelyn's hand. "Well, if you ever need someone to talk to, my door is always open." Miss Evelyn gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple. That's very kind of you." As Miss Marple rose to leave, she noticed a small folded piece of paper lying on the ground near the bench. It must have fallen from Miss Evelyn's pocket. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up, her curiosity getting the better of her. The paper was creased and slightly damp, but the handwriting was still legible. "Meet me at the greenhouse tonight. We need to talk. G." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The note was unsigned, but the initial G was unmistakable. Mead glanced back at Miss Evelyn, who was still staring at the roses, oblivious to the dropped note. Carefully, Miss Marple slipped the paper into her pocket and continued her stroll, her mind racing. The greenhouse again, the same place where she had overheard Mr. Grayson and Miss Evelyn speaking the day before. Whatever was happening, it was clear that the greenhouse was a focal point. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village settled into its usual quiet, Miss Marple made her way back to the manor grounds. The fog had returned, lending an eerie quality to the garden as she approached the greenhouse. She moved silently, her footsteps muffled by the damp grass. From the shadows, she watched as Miss Evelyn slipped inside, her figure barely visible through the fogged glass. Moments later, Mr. Grayson appeared. Glancing around nervously before following her in, Miss Marple crept closer, her heart pounding in her ears. The conversation inside was hushed but urgent. "We can't keep doing this," Miss Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "If she finds out—" "She won't," Mr. Grayson interrupted, his tone sharp. "Not if we stick to the plan. But you need to stay calm. Panicking will only make things worse." "I'm trying," Miss Evelyn replied, her voice breaking. "But I can't keep living like this. It's too much." Miss Marple's mind raced. What plan were they referring to? And who was the she they were so afraid of? Lady Beatrice, or someone else entirely? As she strained to hear more, a sudden rustling in the bushes made her freeze. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the fog-shrouded garden. For a moment she saw nothing, and then a shadow moved, slipping away into the mist. Chapter 7. The Bitter Brew. The fog clung to the village like a shroud as Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, her mind a whirlwind of questions. The whispered conversation in the greenhouse, the shadowy figure lurking in the garden, and the cryptic note she had found. All of it pointed to a web of secrets far more tangled than she had initially suspected. The next morning, she decided to pay a visit to Dr. Cartwright, the village physician. If anyone knew the comings and goings of the villagers, it was he. She found him in his study, surrounded by shelves of medical texts and jars of mysterious substances. "Miss Marple," he said, looking up from his desk with a warm smile, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I was hoping to pick your brain, Doctor," she said, returning his smile. "There's been so much excitement in the village lately, and I can't help but feel there's more to it than meets the eye." Dr. Cartwright's smile faltered slightly, though he quickly recovered. "Oh, what sort of excitement?" "The missing letter, for one," Miss Marple said, her tone casual. "And then there's the stranger, Mr. Grayson. He seems to have stirred up quite a bit of curiosity." The doctor's expression grew thoughtful. "Yes, Mr. Grayson is an interesting character. I've only spoken to him briefly, but he seems to be a man of few words. And Miss Evelyn Hart," Miss Marple continued, watching him closely. "She's been rather out of sorts lately. Have you noticed?" Dr. Cartwright hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of his desk. "I have, actually. She came to see me a few days ago, complaining of sleeplessness and anxiety. I prescribed her a mild sedative, but I'm not sure it's helping." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Anxiety, sleeplessness. What could be troubling the young woman so deeply? "And Lady Beatrice?" she asked. "How is she faring?" This doctor's face darkened. "Lady Beatrice is a difficult patient. She's been under a great deal of stress lately, though she refuses to discuss it. I've tried to persuade her to rest, but she's as stubborn as ever." Miss Marple thanked him and took her leave, her thoughts churning. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, though the picture they formed was still unclear. That afternoon she received an unexpected invitation to tea at the manor. Lady Beatrice's note was brief and to the point, but Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of urgency. She arrived at the appointed hour, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the grand drawing-room. Lady Beatrice greeted her with a strained smile, her usual poise replaced by a visible tension. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple. I thought it was time we had a proper chat." "Of course," Miss Marple said, settling into her chair. "I'm always happy for a good conversation." The tea was served in Lady Beatrice's finest china, the delicate cups and saucers gleaming in the afternoon light. Miss Marple noted the absence of the gold-trimmed set, though she said nothing. As they sipped their tea, Lady Beatrice's gaze grew distant. "I'm sure you've heard about the missing letter," she said at last, her voice tight. "I have," Miss Marple replied, her tone neutral. "It must be very distressing for you." "It is," Lady Beatrice said, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "That letter contained sensitive information. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could ruin me." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you have any idea who might have taken it?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the window. "I have my suspicions, but I can't be sure. That's why I need your help, Miss Marple. You have a way of seeing things others miss." Miss Marple nodded, though she was careful not to commit herself. "I'll do what I can, of course, but I'll need to know more about the letter and why it's so important." Lady Beatrice's face paled, and for a moment it seemed she might refuse. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "The letter is evidence of a past mistake, a mistake that could destroy my reputation if it were made public." Before Miss Marple could press further, a sudden commotion erupted from the kitchen. The sound of breaking china and a muffled cry sent both women to their feet. "What on earth?" Lady Beatrice began, but she was interrupted by the arrival of a pale-faced maid. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," the maid stammered, her eyes wide with fear. "It's just the teacup. It's broken." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Which teacup?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "The one from the set," the maid replied, wringing her hands. "The one with the gold trim. It just shattered." Beatrice's face drained of colour. "That's impossible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That set hasn't been used in years." The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Miss Marple glanced at Lady Beatrice, who was staring at the broken shards with a look of pure dread. "Perhaps it was an accident," Miss Marple said softly, though she knew better. "Perhaps," Lady Beatrice replied, her voice hollow. But her eyes told a different story. Chapter 8. Behind the Locked Door. The broken teacup lay in pieces on the kitchen floor, its gold trim glinting faintly in the dim light. Miss Marple knelt beside it, her fingers brushing the shards, as she examined the pattern of the break. Sheer edges were jagged, but the way the pieces had scattered suggested the cup had been dropped with force rather than clumsiness. "Too neat," she murmured to herself, her eyes narrowing. "Too intentional." Lady Beatrice stood in the doorway, her face pale and her hands clenched at her sides. "This is no accident," she said, her voice trembling with barely suppressed anger. "Someone is trying to send me a message." Miss Marple rose to her feet, her expression thoughtful. "A message? What kind of message?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the hallway. I can't say, not here." Miss Marple nodded, understanding the unspoken implication. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private." Lady Beatrice led her down a narrow corridor to a small sitting room, its walls lined with bookshelves and heavy drapes. She closed the door firmly behind them, her movements quick and nervous. "Miss Marple," she began, her voice low and urgent, "there are things about my past that I've kept hidden for years, secrets that could ruin me if they were ever revealed." "The missing letter," Miss Marple said gently. It's connected to these secrets, isn't it?" Lady Beatrice nodded, her eyes filled with fear. "Yes, the letter contains proof of something I did long ago, something I'm not proud of. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could destroy everything I've built." Miss Marple studied her carefully, noting the way her hands trembled and her voice wavered. "Do you have any idea who might have taken it?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I have my suspicions, but I can't be sure. That's why I need your help, Miss Marple. You have a way of seeing things others miss." Miss Marple nodded, though she was careful not to commit herself. "I'll do what I can, of course, but I'll need to know more about the letter and why it's so important." Lady Beatrice's face paled, and for a moment it seemed she might refuse. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "The letter is evidence of a past mistake, a mistake that could destroy my reputation if it were made public." Before Miss Marple could press further, a sudden noise from the hallway made them both freeze. It was the sound of footsteps, quick and light, followed by the faint creak of a door opening and closing. "Did you hear that?" Lady Beatrice whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "Stay here," she said softly, moving toward the door. She stepped into the hallway, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. The corridor was empty, but a faint draught suggested a door had recently been opened. She followed the draught to a narrow staircase leading to the upper floors, her sharp eyes noting the faint scuff marks on the steps. At the top of the stairs, she found herself in a dimly lit hallway lined with closed doors. One door, however, stood slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. Miss Marple approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her ears. The room beyond was small and sparsely furnished, its walls lined with shelves filled with dusty books and trinkets. In the centre of the room stood a writing desk, its surface cluttered with papers and envelopes. Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small, locked drawer at the bottom of the desk, its key still in the lock. She hesitated for a moment before turning the key and opening the drawer. Inside, she found a stack of letters, their edges yellowed with age. She picked up the topmost letter, her eyes scanning the contents. The words were sharp and accusatory, the handwriting familiar. It was a letter from Lady Beatrice's late husband, written shortly before his death. The accusations were damning, suggesting that Lady Beatrice had been involved in something far more sinister than a simple mistake. Miss Marple's breath caught as she read the final lines. "If you ever reveal the truth, I will ensure that you pay for what you've done." She carefully replaced the letter and closed the drawer, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, though the picture they formed was still unclear. As she turned to leave, a sudden movement caught her eye. A shadow flickered in the doorway, and for a moment she thought she saw the faint outline of a figure. But when she stepped into the hallway, it was empty. "Someone is watching," she murmured to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "And they're closer than I thought." Chapter 9. The Web Tightens. Miss Marple returned to the sitting-room, her mind a whirlwind of questions. The letter she had found in the locked drawer was damning, but it raised more questions than it answered. What had Lady Beatrice done to provoke such a threat from her late husband? And who else knew about it? Lady Beatrice was pacing the room when Miss Marple entered, her face pale and her hands clenched at her sides. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her tone measured. "But before we discuss it, I need to know more about your late husband. What kind of man was he?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. He was a difficult man, proud, stubborn, and quick to anger. But he was also deeply protective of our family's reputation. "And the letter?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "What did it contain?" Lady Beatrice's face paled, and for a moment it seemed she might refuse to answer. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It was a threat. He had discovered something about my past, something I thought was buried forever. He said he would expose me if I ever revealed the truth." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And now the letter is missing. Do you think someone else has discovered this secret?" Lady Beatrice's hands trembled as she sank into a chair. "I don't know, but if they have, it could ruin me." Miss Marple studied her carefully, noting the fear in her eyes and the tension in her voice. "Is there anyone in the village who might have a reason to harm you? Anyone who might have known your husband?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, her gaze flickering towards the window. "There is one person, Mr. Grayson. He was a business associate of my husband's. They had a falling out shortly before my husband's death." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And Miss Evelyn Hart? What is her connection to all of this?" Beatrice's face darkened. "Evelyn is my niece. She came to live with me after her parents passed away. But she's been distant lately, and I can't help but feel she's hiding something." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, though the picture they formed was still unclear. "I think it's time we had a conversation with Mr. Grayson and Miss Evelyn," she said at last. Lady Beatrice's eyes widened in alarm. "But what if they're involved? What if they're working together?" "Then we'll find out," Miss Marple replied, her tone firm. "But we must proceed carefully. If they are involved, we can't afford to tip them off." That evening Miss Marple made her way to the village inn where Mr. Grayson was staying. She found him in the common room, seated by the fire with a glass of brandy in hand. He looked up as she approached, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone polite but wary. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I was hoping to have a word with you," she replied, taking a seat across from him. "About Lady Beatrice." Mr. Grayson's expression darkened, though he quickly masked it with a smile. "What about her?" I understand you were a business associate of her late husband," Miss Marple said, her tone casual. "I was wondering if you might know anything about a missing letter." Mr. Grayson's grip tightened on his glass, though his voice remained steady. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." Miss Marple studied him carefully, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes flickered toward the door. "Are you sure? It's a matter of great importance to Lady Beatrice." Mr. Grayson hesitated, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple, but I can't help you." Miss Marple nodded, though she wasn't convinced. As she rose to leave, she noticed a small folded piece of paper lying on the table beside Mr. Grayson's glass. It was the same handwriting she had seen in the note to Miss Evelyn. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Grayson," she said, her tone polite. "I'll let you get back to your evening." As she stepped out into the cool night air, her mind raced. The web of secrets was tightening, and she was beginning to see the threads that connected them all. But one question remained. Who was pulling the strings? Chapter 10. A Motive. Written in blood. The village of St. Mary Mead lay under a blanket of stars, the night air crisp and still. Miss Marple walked briskly back to her cottage, her mind churning with the revelations of the evening, the folded note she had glimpsed beside Mr. Grayson's glass. The tension in his voice and Lady Beatrice's palpable fear all pointed to a conspiracy far darker than she had initially imagined. As she unlocked her front door, she noticed a faint light flickering in the window of the cottage next door. Mrs. Bartlett, the postmistress, was still awake, her silhouette visible through the lace curtains. Miss Marple hesitated for a moment before knocking softly on the door. Mrs. Bartlett opened it, her face flushed with surprise. "Miss Marple, what brings you here at this hour?" "I'm sorry to disturb you," Miss Marple said, her tone apologetic, "but I was wondering if you could tell me anything about Mr. Grayson. Has he received any letters or telegrams since he arrived in the village?" Mrs. Bartlett's eyes widened, and she glanced over her shoulder, as though checking for eavesdroppers. "Well, now that you mention it, he did receive a telegram a few days ago. I didn't think much of it at the time, but—" "But what?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Mrs. Bartlett lowered her voice. "It was from London, and the sender's name, it was the same as Lady Beatrice's late husband." Miss Marple's breath caught. "Are you certain?" Mrs. Bartlett nodded. "Positive. I remember because it struck me as odd. Why would someone with the same name be sending telegrams to Mr. Grayson?" Miss Marple thanked her and returned to her cottage, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more sinister than she had anticipated. The next morning she made her way to the vicarage, where Mrs. Harmon greeted her with a warm smile. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise! What brings you here?" "I was hoping to speak with Miss Evelyn Hart," Miss Marple said, her tone casual. "Is she here?" Mrs. Harmon's smile faltered. "I'm afraid not. She left early this morning, saying she needed to run an errand, but she seemed troubled." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Did she say where she was going?" "No, but she did mention something about the manor," Mrs. Harmon replied. "She said she needed to speak with Lady Beatrice." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Thank you, Mrs. Harmon. You've been very helpful." She made her way to the manor, her steps quick and purposeful. As she approached the gates, she noticed a figure slipping through the garden. Miss Evelyn, her auburn hair barely visible beneath a dark shawl. Miss Marple followed at a distance, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Miss Evelyn entered the greenhouse, her movements quick and nervous. Miss Marple crept closer, her heart pounding in her ears. Through the fogged glass, she could see Miss Evelyn speaking with Mr. Grayson, their voices low and urgent. "We can't keep doing this," Miss Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "If she finds out—" "She won't," Mr. Grayson interrupted, his tone sharp. "Not if we stick to the plan. But you need to stay calm. Panicking will only make things worse." "I'm trying," Miss Evelyn replied, her voice breaking. "But I can't keep living like this. It's too much." Miss Marple's mind raced. What plan were they referring to? And who was the she they were so afraid of? Lady Beatrice? Or someone else entirely? As she strained to hear more, a sudden rustling in the bushes made her freeze. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the fog-shrouded garden. For a moment she saw nothing, and then a shadow moved, slipping away into the mist. Chapter 11. The Final Revelation. The shadow in the garden vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Miss Marple with a lingering sense of unease. She glanced back at the greenhouse, where Miss Evelyn and Mr. Grayson were still deep in conversation. Their voices were hushed, but the tension between them was palpable. Miss Marple knew she had to act quickly. Whoever had been watching them, whether it was Lady Beatrice, Dr. Cartwright, or someone else entirely, was clearly involved in the unfolding mystery. She retreated quietly from the garden, her mind racing as she formulated a plan. By the time she returned to the village, the sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the cobblestone streets. Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where she found Mrs. Harmon tending to her roses. "Miss Marple!" Mrs. Harmon greeted her with a smile. "What brings you here?" "I need your help," Miss Marple said, her tone urgent but calm. "There's something happening at the manor, and I believe it's connected to the missing letter. I need to gather everyone together. Lady Beatrice, Mr. Grayson, Miss Evelyn, and Dr. Cartwright. Can you help me arrange a meeting?" Mrs. Harmon's eyes widened, but she nodded without hesitation. "Of course. I'll send word immediately." That evening, the guests gathered in the drawing-room of the manor, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Lady Beatrice sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clenched in her lap. Mr. Grayson stood by the window, his expression unreadable, while Miss Evelyn fidgeted nervously with her necklace. Dr. Cartwright, seated near the fireplace, looked uneasy, his eyes darting around the room. Miss Marple stood at the centre of the room, her calm demeanour a stark contrast to the tension in the air. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady. "I believe it's time we address the events that have been troubling this village." Lady Beatrice's gaze snapped to her, her eyes filled with fear. "What do you mean?" "I mean the missing letter," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm. "The broken teacup, the secret meetings in the garden, all of it is connected, and I believe I know why." Mr. Grayson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Miss Evelyn's hands trembled, and she looked as though she might faint. Dr. Cartwright shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face pale. "The letter," Miss Marple continued, "contained evidence of a secret that Lady Beatrice has been desperate to keep hidden. But it's not just her secret, is it? It's yours as well, Mr. Grayson, and yours, Miss Evelyn, and yours, Dr. Cartwright." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone. Lady Beatrice's face drained of colour, and she looked as though she might collapse. "What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm saying that the letter was a threat," Miss Marple replied, her eyes scanning the room. "A threat from Lady Beatrice's late husband, who knew the truth about what happened all those years ago. But he's not the only one who knew, is he? You all knew, and you've been trying to keep it hidden ever since." Mr. Grayson stepped forward, his expression dark. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Miss Marple said, her tone sharp. "The broken teacup wasn't an accident. It was a message, a warning. And the shadow in the garden? That was someone trying to protect their own secrets. But the truth can't stay hidden forever." Miss Evelyn burst into tears, her hands covering her face. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she sobbed. "I just wanted to protect her." "Protect who?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Lady Beatrice," Miss Evelyn replied, her voice breaking. "She's my aunt. I couldn't let her be destroyed." Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening. "And you, Dr. Cartwright, what's your role in all of this?" The doctor hesitated, his face pale. I was trying to help, but I didn't know it would go this far." Miss Marple turned to Lady Beatrice, her gaze steady. "And you? What do you have to say?" Lady Beatrice's hands trembled as she looked around the room. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered. "I just wanted to protect my family." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard we try to hide it. But sometimes it's better to face it than to live in fear. The room fell, silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the assembled guests, her mind already turning to the next steps. "Now," she said, her tone firm but kind, "let's talk about how we're going to fix this." Chapter 12. The Web Unravelled. The drawing-room was heavy with silence, the weight of Miss Marple's words hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Lady Beatrice sat rigidly in her chair, her face pale and her hands trembling. Mr. Grayson stood by the window, his sharp eyes darting between the others, while Miss Evelyn wiped away tears, her composure crumbling. Dr. Cartwright, usually so composed, looked as though he might bolt from the room at any moment. Miss Marple, calm and unflinching, took a step forward, her voice steady but firm. "The truth, as they say, will out, and I believe it's time we laid it all bare." Lady Beatrice's voice was a whisper, barely audible. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Miss Marple said, her gaze sweeping the room, "that this mystery began long before the broken teacup or the missing letter. It began with a secret so dark it has haunted this village for years." Mr. Grayson's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Miss Evelyn let out a stifled sob, and Dr. Cartwright shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Miss Marple turned to Lady Beatrice. "Your late husband discovered something about your past, didn't he? Something that threatened to destroy you. And he used that knowledge to control you, even after his death." Lady Beatrice's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white. "He was a cruel man," she said, her voice trembling. "But I had no choice. I had to protect my family." "And what about you, Mr. Grayson?" Miss Marple asked, turning to him. "You were his business partner, weren't you? You knew about the letter, about the threat it contained, and you've been using it to manipulate Lady Beatrice ever since." Mr. Grayson's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her tone unwavering. "You've been working with Miss Evelyn, haven't you? She's your niece, after all, and you've been using her to keep Lady Beatrice in line." Miss Evelyn's face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," she sobbed. "I just wanted to protect her." "And you, Dr. Cartwright, Miss Marple said, turning to the physician. "You've been helping them, haven't you? Prescribing sedatives to keep Lady Beatrice compliant, covering up their tracks. But you didn't count on the teacup breaking, did you? Or the letter going missing?" Dr. Cartwright's face was ashen. I didn't know it would go this far," he stammered. "I just wanted to help." Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening. The truth is often painful, but it's the only way to move forward. The broken teacup, the missing letter, the shadow in the garden, it was all part of a web of lies and deceit. But the web is unraveling, and the truth is finally coming to light. She turned to Lady Beatrice, her gaze steady. "The letter contained evidence of a crime, didn't it? A crime committed long ago, but one that has haunted you ever since." Lady Beatrice's shoulders slumped, and she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I made a terrible mistake, and I've been paying for it ever since." Miss Marple's eyes softened with compassion. "The past cannot be changed, but it can be faced, and it's time to face it." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the assembled guests, her mind already turning to the next steps. "Now," she said, her tone firm but kind, "let's talk about how we're going to fix this." Chapter 13. Epilogue. The Shadows Fade. The village of St. Mary Mead returned to its quiet rhythm, the fog of mystery lifting as the truth came to light. The days that followed the revelation in the drawing-room were marked by a strange sense of relief, as though a long-held breath had finally been exhaled. Lady Beatrice, though shaken, found a measure of peace in confronting her past. She decided to leave the manor for a time, retreating to a quiet estate by the sea, where she could reflect and heal. Before she left, she visited Miss Marple, her gratitude evident in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I don't know what would have become of me if you hadn't intervened." Miss Marple smiled gently. "The truth has a way of setting us free, even when it's painful. I hope you find the peace you're looking for." Mr. Grayson, his schemes, unravelled, left the village without fanfare. His departure was swift and unceremonious, though rumours swirled about his eventual fate. Some said he returned to London, while others claimed he vanished into obscurity. Whatever the case, his shadow no longer loomed over St. Mary Mead. Evelyn Hart, freed from the weight of her secrets, found solace in the support of the village. She moved into the vicarage, where Mrs. Harmon took her under her wing, offering comfort and guidance. Over time, the young woman's nervous demeanour softened, and she began to rebuild her life, one step at a time. Dr. Cartwright, though deeply ashamed of his role in the affair, chose to stay in the village. He dedicated himself to making amends, offering his services to those in need without hesitation. His patients noticed a change in him, a newfound humility that made him a better physician and a better man. As for Miss Marple, she returned to her cottage, her knitting needles clicking softly as she reflected on the events that had unfolded. The mystery had been solved, but the echoes of it lingered in her mind, a reminder of the darkness that could lurk beneath even the most tranquil surface. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village settled into its usual quiet, Miss Marple sat by her window, her gaze drifting toward the manor. The house stood silent and still, its windows dark and unyielding. "The shadows fade," she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible. "But they leave their mark, don't they?" She picked up her knitting, the familiar rhythm of the needles soothing her thoughts. The village was safe once more, its secrets laid to rest. But Miss Marple knew that, in a place like St. Mary, Mead, another mystery, was always just around the corner, and she would be ready.